All right, welcome Valencia students to lecture number 17, where we're going to be building upon our concepts of medieval European identity, looking at a very specific period of history and a very specific phenomenon of interactions between West Europeans and between peoples of the Middle East, particularly those of the Islamic and Jewish faiths, an era referred to as the Crusades. We will talk about how the Crusades helped to form a solidified concept of a West European identity, and along with that, some of the perceptions that European Christians had of Muslims in the Middle East, and in turn, the perceptions Muslims in the Middle East had of European Christians, and in many ways, how these legacies are still influencing the world today. So, to understand something about the nature of the Crusades, as always, we need to identify some elements of geography. Because much of what the Crusades are about, while it is going to be religious, based upon the elements of the slogans used, the groups that are fighting against each other, in many ways what it is it is a fight over control of the Mediterranean Sea. What we'll see is, as the Crusades started evolving, is that people who referred to themselves as Europeans lived north of the Mediterranean. Those who identified as Muslims lived in the south of the Mediterranean. And more we're going to see there was a deep concern that Europeans had, is that these Islamic empires of the Middle East, well, they were the middlemen when it came to control of Asiatic trade. They were the ones who went over and interacted with people from India. These people from India were getting the different silks and spices from China. So there's an economic factor here. But what is going to be the forefront of riling people up to get involved in these series of wars that continued for several hundred years is to invoke language about the Holy Land and the different traditions of the three Abrahamic faiths. Typically, when people talk about the Crusades, they talk about a period of 1095, when the very first crusade will be declared by the Pope, going up to usually around 1250 CE. We're going to take a broader picture here. We're going to look at what helped to bring about the trigger for the very first crusade. We will talk about what helped to bring an end to the phenomenon of the Crusades, and then we'll try to talk about how Islamic civilizations in the Middle East reacted to the Crusades with their own military campaigns, stressed on focusing upon invading elements of Eastern Europe. What we'll see during this time, Catholics are going to be consistently called upon to conquer the Holy Land, go forward, go forward. Muslims and Jews together will try to defend the Middle East from Catholic invaders. And then after that is that Muslims and Jews from the Middle East will start trying to invade Europe to prevent any future invasions from Catholics. And what we'll see, as we've tried to talk before with Islam, the point of Islam was to try to bring about a sense of peace between the three Abrahamic faiths. What we'll see is a permanent split of cultures where people associate the East with a aspect of Judaism and Islam united together, and they will associate West with Europe and the Roman Catholic Church. So, let's move forward and look at a map of how the Crusades are going to play out. So, as I've tried to emphasize, is that since the downfall of Rome, and Rome had been the first power to control the entirety of the Mediterranean Sea, is that different major powers saw the Mediterranean Sea as the key element to power throughout the Western world. And what we'll see is much of what helps to trigger a military conflict between Roman Catholic forces, with a few Byzantines thrown in there, and Islamic forces, is that Muslims controlled the southern parts of the Mediterranean, going up into elements of Spain, encroaching into elements of Europe. We talked about in our previous lecture with the kingdom of the Franks, pushing Muslims back to prevent a potential invasion of the rest of Europe, and peoples referring to themselves as European Christians controlling the northern parts of the Mediterranean. What we'll see is that the key battle is looking at the most eastern points of the Mediterranean, centered upon the Holy Land, this time called Palestine, and the particularly holy city of Jerusalem. So, during the era of the Crusades, and still to this day, Why is it the city of Jerusalem is such a contested city in the international community? And it has to do with the fact that the three different Abrahamic faiths all claim this to be one of their most important holy cities. So the Jewish perception upon this is that Jerusalem and the territory around them had been given to them by God, that this land had been promised to Abraham and his descendants, that Jerusalem, and particularly the ability to build a temple in Jerusalem, was one of the most important features of Judaism. And what brought an end to Jews having control of this holy city was when Romans came through, as we pointed out before, during the uprisings of the 7th century, the Romans coming through and killing off 1.1 million Jews, the uprisings of later on, around the year 135 CE, when Bar Kokhba, the Jewish Messiah, came forward, reestablished an independent kingdom, and the Romans came through and they wiped out another 600,000 Jews. Jews had been forced out of these areas, but when Muslim forces took over the holy city of Jerusalem, they invited Jews back, and they invited Jews to live in peace throughout Muslim-controlled territories. And this was highly irksome to Christians, because while Christians were still given open access to the holy city of Jerusalem, they felt that Jews shouldn't be allowed in Jerusalem. There had been the Roman Catholic faith that helped drive Jews out, and by this point, Judaism is illegal in Roman Catholic areas. But along with this there was a deep-seated notion based upon interpretations of the book of Revelation at the end of the Christian New Testament that Jerusalem would be the place where Jesus Christ would return to rule over all of humanity for 1,000 years, reigning at end of times, one might say. So there within Jerusalem, they believed that there was holy objects that would help to prove the divinity, that Jesus was not, as the Jews said, just an intriguing rabbi, or as the Muslims said, just a great prophet, but to prove that Jesus was God himself and the key to salvation. And the great battle of Armageddon would be triggered there around the territory of Jerusalem, and the city of Jerusalem would be the capital city where Christ would come back to rule over humanity, both on a spiritual level and a political level. Now, Islam, as a faith that was based upon trying to reinterpret some of these stories and to bring about a reconciliation between other peoples of the book, is that when Muslims took over Jerusalem, they said they would protect these things for all of the three Abrahamic faiths. They said, as fellow descendants of Abraham, is that since they came from the line of Ishmael and Jews came from the line of Isaac, that Jews should be welcomed back to these places, that these different holy sites surrounded by the stories of King David, surrounded by the stories of the temple, surrounded by the stories of the life of Jesus, that these were incredibly important for all of the faiths, and that it was the role of Muslims to allow all of these different faiths to have free access, particularly for pilgrimages. Now, the key element then is that all three of these faiths during the time of the Crusades claim that Jerusalem needs to be under their control. All three have a little bit of a different take of how they would rule Jerusalem, but still to this day, all three faiths contest Jerusalem as to who should control it, and particularly over the last couple of years, asking the question, should Jerusalem be considered the capital of Israel? According to the United Nations, that's never supposed to happen. The capital of Israel is supposed to be the city of Tel Aviv. But during the Trump administration, the United States took a step forward and said, we recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and we are going to move our American embassy and consulate there. And that has caused all sorts of different issues. So, let's look at the holy city of Jerusalem and the interaction of the three different Abrahamic faiths during the era of the Crusades. So, in previous lectures, we've identified some of the elements of problems that were starting to happen between those who lived in western parts of Europe, who identified with the Roman Catholic faith, and those who lived in eastern parts, closer to the great city of Constantinople, who started referring to themselves as being Eastern Orthodox. We're going to see in the year 1054 is that Pope Leo IX decides to take a very specific stand to try to force Eastern Orthodox practitioners to fall in line with Catholic practices and to ban elements of diversity that existed within the communities of the Eastern Orthodox faith. What the Pope is going to declare is that everyone has to use Latin when it comes to their services, particularly in areas of Greece. In areas of Greece, people were giving their services in Greek. The congregation couldn't understand this. But part of the aspect of the Pope in making this decision is that if the Bible was only printed in Latin, and if masses were only given in Latin, and the only people who really knew Latin were highly educated people and priests, is that you could trick people into believing certain things. It was a power dynamic. When the Pope puts this forward, is the Patriarch of Constantinople, the Bishop of Constantinople, is going to say, you can't ban Greek people from using their own language in their Mass. And I'm going to take a stand against you. And Pope Leo is going to decide it is time for this conflict of ideas to come for a forefront through what is called the Great Schism. Now, the excuse people are going to use for this is that the sign of the cross is being done wrong. So as I said before, if you're a Roman Catholic, if you walk into a Catholic church, there'll be a little sign of holy water. You take 2 fingers, you dip it in, you touch your forehead. You touch your mid-sternum, you touch the left, you touch the right, because the founder of the Roman Catholic faith, Peter, had been crucified by the Romans upside down. It is a tribute to the founder of the faith. Now, as we know in modern times, oftentimes people, if they think of an upside-down cross, they think about that as an evil, satanic symbol. That is going to come from the interpretation of Patriarch Siricius of Constantinople. What he is going to say is that Catholics do the sign wrong, and that actually they're being tricked by the devil into doing an upside-down cross. That an upside-down cross represents evil. And the Pope is going to say, you show no respect for the one true universal faith because you do a cross that goes from here down to your stomach, to the right, and to the left. And that the entire point of using that symbol as you come in is to show reverence for the establishment of the church, and then the rest of the Mass is to show reverence for Jesus of Nazareth. So what Pope Leo is going to do is that if you won't use Latin, and if you do the sign of the cross wrong, guess what? Patriarch, you're excommunicated. And based upon Roman Catholic doctrine at this time, if you are excommunicated and separated from the church, that's essentially Pope Leo saying, I have just banished you to hell for all of eternity. And the Patriarch says, we don't believe in your power and authority, so therefore I have the true power, and I excommunicate you from the one true faith of Eastern Orthodox. And there had been a great problem right around the year 1000, because people like to look at things in years of 100-year periods or 1,000-year periods. And around the year 1000 CE, there had been a great movement throughout Christian kingdoms of believing 1000 CE, this is when Christ is going to return. And when Christ did not return in 1000 CE, the Patriarch and the Pope each blamed the other side. Each one said the other side must be evil, conspiring against sins. They both declare each other evil. So we're going to take Christians. One group of Christians says, we are the right faith, you're wrong, you are evil. The other group of Christians says, we are the right faith, you are wrong, you are evil. And then let's see if we can bring them back together by finding another group of the Abrahamic faiths to declare to be evil. So, 40 years after the official Great Schism, Pope Urban II came up with a plan to try to reunify the Christian faith under the leadership of the Pope. He believed he could unite Catholics and Orthodox Christians to the one true Christian faith by declaring a holy war against Islam and attempting to retake the holy city of Jerusalem. Now, one of the aspects of why the Pope chose this was not just to try and reunify people, but an attempt to stabilize Europe. For the past 400 to 500 years prior to this, with the rise of feudal kingdoms, you had more and more knights all over, and knights, to rise up in promotion, is that they would try to attack other nobles, to have murder, mayhem, to steal each other's lands and titles. Essentially, knights were causing... They weren't a source of great poetry and things like that by this point. Knights were causing constant civil war. So if the Pope can figure out a place to shift all the knights away and to inflict violence and bloodshed upon other peoples, well, what a great way to get them the hell out of Europe. But he offered them a little bonus. As he said, I, as God's representative, have the ability not of you having to go to confession, because at this point, the Roman Catholic faith, it was central that on a regular basis, one went to confession with a priest where you confessed all of your sins, and the priest would assist you in having your sins forgiven. As the Pope said, I will grant you a specific form called an indulgence. I said, if you go forth in this holy war against the blasphemy of Islam and the satanic forces of Islam, is that God will grant you a forgiveness for all of your sins for all time. This first starts out as simply a certificate for those who are willing to participate in crusades. Later on, the popes will say, hey, maybe we can just sell these certificates and make a lot of money. And the way the Pope gets away with it is when people say, can you do that? Is that in the Bible? As the Pope says, well, of course it's in the Bible. It's not in the Bible. But this also means if you are a knight, you know, basic things in the 10 Commandments, such as thou shalt not kill, all of your sins have been forgiven. So in your mind, you can kill whoever you want and however many you want, and you are going to go straight to heaven in paradise for participating in this holy war. And as the Crusaders coming forward, the Caliph of the Islamic faith and the Islamic empires is going to have a position of defense. One of the challenges the Caliph was dealing with is that Islam, much like Christianity, had split into two different factions. You had Sunni, you had Shia, and the Caliph was Sunni. And the Sunni Caliph wanted to get the Shia to unite with the Sunni to recognize the Caliph as the true leader of the Islamic faith. So he said, the goal of this is that the Christian infidel is invading, and according to Islam, Muslims are not supposed to be allowed to attack other people, particularly fellow people of the book. But if other people attack you and invade your homeland, you are allowed to declare jihad, which is a form of holy war. But let's clarify what jihad is. Jihad means that you are having an internal struggle because you see something as wrong, and that Allah moves your heart to correct that wrong. So jihad is not just a holy war of actual physical battle and things like that. 90% of jihad is actually people just speaking out against things. If they see something that's wrong, is you don't look the other way. All of my Muslim roommates have tried to help me to understand that concept of jihad, but we don't have enough time to go into all the details. But one form of jihad is a holy war, and the Caliph claims if you go forward and you fight in this holy war, whether you're Sunni, whether you're Shia, if you are protecting our homes and our families, if you die in this holy war, you will go straight to heaven. After a while, he also says that there'll be a number of virgins waiting for you as a holy warrior. Essentially, both sides, the Christian side and the Islamic side, are going to put forward a very extreme position saying go forth in battle, even though both sides claim they represent Jesus. And if you die in this battle, you will be granted eternal paradise. A very extreme interpretation of things where both the Pope and the Caliph are going to attempt to unify their people in a common cause of bloodshed and violence. So, the greatest tragedy of the Crusades, after both sides had been radicalized by extremist positions, is the legacy of massacres. Both sides representing to claim the true legacy of Jesus, and both sides causing pain and suffering upon each other in ways that are almost impossible for us to comprehend in the modern world. So Pope Urban II, in order to try to bring together a reunification of the Roman Catholic faith and the Eastern Orthodox, declared that the holy city of Jerusalem needed to be retaken by Catholic warriors. He has granted a forgiveness for all of their sins. So the Catholic warriors start gathering from around Western Europe. They start marching towards the city of Constantinople to gather together to create an organized military force there, and then to march forward into the Holy Land. And for a while, this aspect of Pope Urban II is going to work, because many warriors of the Eastern Orthodox faith, when they heard that the Pope has forgiven all of their sins, that means that they can steal, they can plunder, they can murder, and if they die in the process, they'll still go straight to heaven. So after several years, Catholic warriors side by side with Eastern Orthodox warriors who had switched back to the Roman Catholic faith finally arrived in the city of Jerusalem in 1099. And according to the stories that have been left over, every single non-Christian in this city was massacred. The Dome of the Rock was destroyed. Every Jewish site was destroyed. And some people claimed that the blood in the streets of Jerusalem ran as high as people's knees. But the Catholics were able to retake Jerusalem and to hold it for almost 100 years. What's going to trigger what we call the Third Crusade is that in 1187 CE, Muslim forces had united enough between Sunni and Shia to march an army into Jerusalem to retake it. The Caliph put out a petition to the Pope saying, "We've retaken the holy city of Jerusalem. Can we simply have a peace negotiation? We will allow Christians, Jews, and Muslims to have full access to the city again if we bring an end to these wars." And the Pope said no, and sent in more crusaders to attempt to retake Jerusalem. And they failed in this. So in 1202 CE, a whole swarm of more Catholic warriors come to the holy city of Constantinople to organize there, to get ready to march forward to Jerusalem, to be able to plunder and murder along the way. And they say, hey, well, we might die in that process of plunder and murder on the way to Jerusalem, since the Eastern Orthodox faith is also a representation of the forces of Satan. Why don't we just plunder Constantinople? So in 1202 CE, the Crusaders plundered a fellow Christian city. They set fire to the city. The population of 500,000, 20,000 people were completely homeless afterwards. And what it helped to trigger is over the next several hundred years, people starting to flee from the city of Constantinople, people of the Eastern Orthodox faith, because they became more fearful of Catholics than they did of Muslims, who were just to their east. And we'll see by the time in our next lecture, when Muslim forces take the city of Constantinople and rename it Istanbul, there was only 50,000 people left. One of the most important cities in European history was triggered as a decline by Christians attacking fellow Christians. And in 1212 CE, young people tried to intervene. Young Catholics who were mortified by all the stories they had heard said, if we organize as kids and go to the holy city of Jerusalem and reach out to Muslims with the love and compassion of Jesus Christ, we can convince them that Jesus was not just a prophet of God, but that Jesus is God and the key to their salvation. So a young French Catholic and a young German Catholic organized together. They organized 30,000 kids. But if you're a kid, you don't want to have to march all the way to Jerusalem. So they started organizing in port cities in southern Italy, saying, can we get on boats and can you take us across the Mediterranean over to Palestine, and we will march into Jerusalem peacefully to reach out to our fellow Muslim brethren. And what's going to happen is these 30,000 kids, they keep getting told by different merchants, oh yes, here, hop onto my ship, and of course, we're taking you to Jerusalem. And they weren't taking Jerusalem. They were taken to the other side of the Mediterranean and just sold into slavery in northern Africa. So at the end of this, what we're going to get after several hundred years of constant invasions and warfare between these peoples is a legacy of defensive fear in Europe. But part of the story that is oftentimes not told is a huge paranoia within the Middle East of Islamic peoples about Christians. So in our next clip, we're going to watch just a minute-and-a-half introduction to a series that was done by the news corporation Al Jazeera several years ago called The Crusades Through Arab Eyes. Now, the entirety of the series lasts in 4 different parts, each episode lasting about 50 minutes. You can easily find it on YouTube if this next clip intrigues you. But this is just a minute-and-a-half introduction warmer to the very first episode to try to understand how Muslims perceived when Christian forces invaded the Middle East.
ابتدت تتكون نوع من الدعاية النازقة لتصوير المسلمين في صورة بشعة تبرر العدوان عليهم. بدأت الجيوش تخرج من غرب أوروبا متوجهة إلى الأرض المقدسة. بعضهم كان خرج للدفاع عن سمعته، وبعضهم خرج لكي يكتسب أرض جديدة ويبني إمبراطورية. لما جه الصليبيين ليسوا أقوى وليسوا أكثر عددا وليسوا أكثر تفوقا في فنون القتال وليسوا أكثر شجاعة وليسوا أكثر تحضرا، ولكنهم انتصروا بفعل هذا التشارطم السياسي والسكاني.
كان دخولا مرعبا. يعني بدأوا بمجزرة يندى لها اليمين، قتلوا الناس في الشوارع، في المنازل، في الأزقة.
الأماكن الإسلامية دنست، قبة الصخرة والمسجد الأقصى كله تعرض للتدنيس وللتدمير.
Now, the part of the story that's always told in world history, but almost never even acknowledged in Western Civ courses, is that what really helped to trigger an end to the process of the Crusades had nothing to do with Christian positions or Islamic positions or the inability to take the holy city of Jerusalem. It is that a group of people who were traditionally known just as tribal nomads all the way over, rooted over on the Pacific part of Asia, just north of China, the Mongolians redefined the entirety of both Western and Eastern civilizations. So let's take a few moments to talk about Genghis Khan. An entire course could be taught about Genghis Khan and his sons and his grandson Kublai Khan and all these different things. We don't have time for this, but let's talk about what the Mongolians did. The Mongolians at this period had been an organized major force in Asia for about around 1,000 years. It's the reason why the Chinese had built the Great Wall of China, was to prevent Mongolians who lived just north in the grasslands just north of China from potentially invading. Because the Mongolians were highly feared because they were highly talented horseback hunters who very accurately shooting arrows while riding horseback, bareback. Ooh. How do you stop these people? What occurred is that a Mongolian leader named Genghis Khan recognized that these different civilizations, because the Mongolians had heard about all these different civilizations, were completely disunified and that they were all fighting against each other. And he decided, why don't we invade our Chinese neighbors to the south? We'll steal some of their technologies and let's see if we can conquer the world. And Genghis Khan, over a period of just over 20 years, is going to conquer 18% of planet Earth. 9.3 million square miles. Still to this day, the largest aspect of a land-connected empire ever in human history. The British will beat that by doing 25% of planet Earth, but their empire is connected by oceans and by navies. Now, what's going to make Genghis Khan so powerful, number one, is he is going to adopt elements of Chinese technology of a thing called gunpowder. The Chinese had developed this to make fireworks. Genghis Khan and many of his soldiers realized that if you took some elements of gunpowder, you put it around an arrow tip, you lit it, you shot the arrow, when it hit things, it went. It's not a bullet yet, but it's the next step to the bullet and the cannonball. What Genghis Khan and his troops are going to be notorious for is when they come across a cities, they have two options. You either submit or we slaughter you all. And along with this, Genghis and his sons are going to become incredibly notorious for inflicting rape upon women of populations. Still to this day, based upon elements of markers within genetics and DNA code, is scientists say, still to this day, 1 of every 200 males on planet Earth is a descendant of Genghis Khan and his sons. Along with gunpowder, one of the other things that the Mongolians are going to recognize is during the time of the Mongolian conquering of the world is that a plague broke out in southeast China that's been referred to as the bubonic plague. It is going to be the world's first global pandemic. And as we know, global pandemics can be very scary because if a virus starts off in China, but people travel around the world, the virus can come with them. And the bubonic plague, this is before medical science. It's people have no idea how to treat it. And it's highly infectious if you touch somebody who has it. When the bubonic plague ended up showing up in Europe, 1/2 of the entire population of Europe died. The Khans are going to successfully conquer 18% of planet Earth, including the entire of the Middle East. They're going to conquer huge parts of what we now call Russia. They're going to get all the way up to Venice, Italy, and then they retreat a bit after Genghis died. But in order to try to secure a lasting peace over all these territories that they had conquered, in the 1320s, the different sons and grandsons of Genghis Khan who were in charge of these different territories throughout the world, as they adopted the faith of Islam. As they had heard from people, Islam is a faith of peace. It stands for reunifying people of the book. And if we are ruling over Christians and Jews and Muslims, well, we'll say that we're Muslim rulers. Now, what's important, Europeans during this time, since they were more scared of the Mongolian invaders than they were of the Islamic invaders, they stopped their advances into the Middle East. But once these Mongolian invaders had solidified parts of their empire and switched over to the faith of Islam, is that Europeans are going to start to think of everything west of the Holy Roman Empire as Asiatic, as Islamic, and as enemies of God. So let's take a quick visual look at some maps to see the influence of the Mongolians upon the process of human history. So in the year 1206, when Genghis was first thought of as a major Mongolian ruler, is the Mongolians control this area just to the north of China, and China's like, we're fine because we got this thing called the Great Wall, and you're not ever going to overcome it. And they're like, yeah, we're going to totally overcome it. Then we're going to grab some of your technology and we're going to conquer you, and then maybe we'll conquer through here, and maybe we'll cross down through here, and we'll conquer through here and conquer through here. Heck, maybe we'll get all the way up here and conquer all this and this. And how does it look in the next slide? Let's see, how much did the Mongolians conquer? What? 18% of planet Earth in a period of just 30 to 40 years. The Mongolians redefined human civilization, and particularly after they adopted the faith of Islam, as the people throughout here identified with rulers from over here, and the people throughout here started identifying, oh, we are being ruled over by Islamic forces, but we are Eastern Orthodox. Maybe we should declare a holy war against them and call ourselves Russian. And people over here are scared to death of the larger world. But after Genghis Khan died, when his sons took over and they created these different khanates throughout the world, it did not take long until after the death of his sons for this entire thing to fall apart. But for a period, the Mongolians ruled almost all of the major parts of what one would call the quote-unquote civilized world. But in the Middle East, for the Mongolians who conquered the Middle East, then when they adopt the Islamic faith, here was the problem, is they adopted a faith of a different people. They didn't fully understand the dynamics of the faith, and they adopted the wrong form of Islam. They adopted Shia Islam, which meant that Sunnis now had in their mind, the right to declare a holy war against the Shia Mongolians and to establish a new caliphate that will go down in history as the Ottoman Empire, that is brought about by peoples of what we now call modern Turkey over here in the Anatolia Peninsula, which had once been a stronghold of the Greek peoples from over here. Now, the Turks initially start off as just a very, very small kingdom here on the Anatolian Peninsula, and people who were very devout Sunni. After the Mongolian rulers adopted Shia Islam, is they called for a rising up of all Sunni Muslims against the outside invaders who had adopted the wrong Islamic faith, and say, we will bring forth a new caliphate to defend Islamic civilization. And this line from the Ottoman Empire is going to work all the way up until the end of World War I. So for a period of close to 640 years, is the Turks will be the dominant power controlling elements of the Islamic world. What they're going to recognize is that if they want to flex themselves as a real power, is that they needed to get rid of the presence of Constantinople completely. So, after becoming the dominant force of Islam in the Middle East, reestablishing a new caliphate, the Ottoman Empire decided, hey, if we want to try to take out Constantinople, here's the first thing we should do. We should cross over here into Southeast Europe, take over these other parts of the Byzantine Empire, and to surround the city of Constantinople. So when they invaded the areas of Southeast Europe, what are referred to as the Balkans, what they did to try to pacify people and keep them in their place is they created a system called the Janissary system. What they did was they imposed a tax. They said, if you still want to be Christian, that's fine, but here's the tax you have to pay. Is that every couple years is we'll have a representative from the Ottoman Empire come through, ask how many young Christian boys there are in your village between the ages of 8 and 16, and that the Ottoman Sultan will kidnap a certain percentage of those children. You will give up your children as a tax. They will be brought back to the Ottoman Empire, and they will be turned Muslim, and they will be great warriors to protect the Sultan. And a group of people over here, the Serbians, some of the great stones on the side of a thing called civilization, is out of any of the Eastern Orthodox peoples of this area. They're going to vehemently resist. For a period of about 100 years, Serbians every 10 to 15 years will organize. They rise up against the Ottoman Empire as holy defenders of the faith, and they will try to push Muslim forces out. It's going to take the Ottoman Empire about 100 years to fully crush them out. But once the Serbian resistance has been crushed out, the Orthodox Church is in a highly, highly contentious state. By the 1440s, they're completely surrounded. The Byzantine Empire doesn't exist. All that exists is the city of Constantinople. The Emperor of Constantinople and the Patriarch of Constantinople reached out to the Pope and said, will you come save us? We are surrounded by Muslims on all sides. And the Pope said, we will come and save you. We will send warriors there on the one condition: you all convert back to the Roman Catholic faith. But by this point, people in the Eastern Orthodox Church had already been being told for the last 400 years, since Catholics did their sign of the cross wrong that represented the devil, is they had bought into a line that the Pope was the Antichrist. And so Eastern Orthodox said, no deal, we're not switching back to the faith of the Antichrist. And Constantinople, as we'll see in our next lecture, is surrounded. And what we'll see is now a permanent split of the Christian faiths, of the West associating themselves with the Roman Catholic Church, and anything to the East being Eastern Orthodox, and people of the Roman Catholic Church perceiving Eastern Orthodox are evil, people of the Eastern Orthodox Church believing Catholics are evil, and the major power center of the Orthodox faith being surrounded by Muslim forces. So, what are the big picture legacies of the Crusades? Because by the time of the 1450s, Islam had become a force to be reckoned with. of the different Abrahamic faiths. We take it for granted in modern times of the different Abrahamic faiths. The Roman Catholic Church is the largest, and the Christians put together far outnumber Muslims, although the rise of Muslims keeps growing and growing. Is that Islam had spread throughout areas throughout what we now call Russia. Islam had spread and taken over and been the dominant faith of almost all of northern Africa, as well as these eastern parts of Africa. Islam had become the political force down here in the Balkans. Islam still controlled Spain, and all of a sudden the only spot left of any aspect of resistance was Constantinople. We'll cover that in our next lecture as we talk about the fall of Constantinople, helping to trigger a new period of European history called the Renaissance. So, what are the legacies and outcomes of the Crusades? What did the Roman Catholic Church contribute to the development of Western civilization? First and foremost, these several hundred years of constant European invasions into the Middle East caused a permanent divide between the different Abrahamic faiths. First and foremost, the Christian leaders completely divided. The Patriarch saying the Pope is the Antichrist. The Pope saying the Patriarch, he's evil, he's misleading people, all these things. So Christians divide. We have Orthodox, we have Catholic. Schism that cannot be brought together. Jews and Muslims are going to unite together. And what the Catholics are going to say, Jews and Muslims uniting together, they reject the divinity of Jesus. And the Prophet Muhammad must be the false prophet that the book of Revelation talked about. So therefore, these people united together are soldiers of Satan. And what it means to be a Catholic for hundreds of years is to declare a holy war against these soldiers of Satan. Now, what's going to happen more and more is a great fear in Europe, and what it comes to be known to be European is a fear of things to the east of what we would call Asia or the Middle East. Christians are going to promote a constant fear of the Asian East, whether it's the Mongolians coming in as an invading force, getting all the way up to Venice, Italy, whether it's afterwards the Turks coming in and taking over the Balkan region. And what we're going to see is that Muslims, in turn, are also going to promote a fear of the Christian European West, saying these people have invaded our forces before, they've invaded our homeland before, they've massacred our people, so therefore we need to invade parts of their land to create a defensive shield between East and West. That is the constant theme of what it means to be part of East Europe, whether it is in the 11th century, whether it's in the 15th century, or whether it's in the later half of the 20th century, is outside forces coming in and creating a shield and utilizing you as a shield between East and between West. But along with this, there will be an underlying call within Europe to try to think more about elements of science. First and foremost, as Europeans started seeing what the Mongolians could do with gunpowder, is there was a European adventurer named Marco Polo who had traveled all the way over to China, met Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, who at that point was known as the Emperor of China. And Kublai Khan made Marco Polo his international ambassador for almost 20 years. And when Marco Polo came back to Europe, he came back with great stories about the scientific advancements and the magic that occurred in a place called China, and particularly a whole lot of stories about gunpowder. Initially, Islamic civilizations are going to adopt gunpowder. They will adopt it from the Mongolian invaders who would come in. For the period after this, is the Islamic empires will be known as the gunpowder empires. But Europeans are going to become more interested in gunpowder. Instead of thinking about propelling it with aspects of arrows, they'll say, hey, if something, we set it on fire, explodes, what if we take something that is metal and put it in a barrel? And, welcome to the birth of guns and cannons. But along with this, Europeans, after the bubonic plague hits, and half of the entire population of Europe dies, and the Roman Catholic Church is blaming it upon demons and all sorts of different things. Or people like, we've got to figure out what can we do to protect ourselves from this plague. And they're going to call for more and more people to start investigating elements of medical science instead of putting faith in miracles and prayers to bring an end to things like plagues. So we'll see in our next lecture with the Renaissance. Renaissance means rebirth. We're going to see a rebirth of elements of science and secular thought within the European experience to adopt new technologies, to think about the world differently, but in particular to try push forward new ideas of medical science.